Listen closely, because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you. The old families, those who built their dynasties on the backs, bones, and silence of others, hid this story so deeply that even their descendants fear speaking its name. They say the night of December 4th, 1839, was swallowed by something older than vengeance, something that moved through a man like a shadow remembering its purpose. And if you've ever felt the pull of forces hidden behind history's pretty lies, you will understand why they tried to erase every trace of him. His name was whispered only once in the surviving court ledgers, Elias Gray. No record before, no record after, as if he stepped out of nothing, then returned to the same place. But in the years that followed, the land itself refused to forget the terror carried on his footsteps. The Grayridge plantation was a fortress of cruelty disguised as Southern aristocracy. The master, Thaddeus Gray, held a reputation so immaculate in public that men traveled counties just to shake his hand. Behind the walls of his moonlit mansion, however, lay a kingdom sculpted from domination, fear, and psychological control. He broke spirits as casually as men break twigs for kindling. He believed suffering was a tool, obedience a science, and power something carved into flesh like scripture. But every tyrant makes the same mistake, assuming the silence of the oppressed is the same as their submission. Elias watched, listened, waited, not for escape, but for equilibrium. Some men break, some men bend, but a rare kind, very rare, learns. Learns how cruelty works, learns where fear lives, learns exactly how to dismantle the mind of a man who believes himself untouchable. And on that single night in 1839, Elias decided the cycle had reached its endpoint. They say he moved like a man guided by something ancient, something that looked through his eyes but wasn't entirely human. Some call it vengeance. Others call it justice. A few, a very few, call it legacy. Because Elias did not choose one target. He chose the entire bloodline, every branch, every heir, every symbol of the Grey dynasty's control. And by dawn, the mansion that once stood as a monument of absolute authority had become a pyre. Its ashes whispered truths the family spent generations trying to silence. Truths I'm about to reveal. Before the flames rose, before the screams twisted into the night wind, before the mansion's heartbeat finally stopped, there was a silence so absolute, so unnaturally heavy, that even the cicadas outside the tree line fell quiet. It was as if the land itself sensed what Elias was about to do, and bowed in solemn recognition. You must understand something before we go deeper. The Grey family didn't just rule through physical dominance. They ruled through psychological architecture, sophisticated systems of control designed to hollow out the will of anyone beneath them. Isolation, humiliation, ritualized obedience, cycles of reward and deprivation, methods learned from older European aristocracies and sharpened across generations. They studied the human mind with the coldness of surgeons, believing fear was a programmable language and people were born to be rewritten. Elias understood this system better than anyone, because he had survived it, and survival teaches a man more about power than any master ever anticipates. For years, they mistook his silence for weakness, his lowered eyes for submission, his calm demeanor for defeat. But inside him, a calculus was forming, a blueprint, a countdown. He memorized the patterns of their routines, the creak of stairways under different footweights, which doors whined when opened, which whispered, which windows could be unlatched without sound, how long it took a candle to burn from wick to puddle, how the wind shifted around the mansion depending on the hour. The family believed they were studying him, but Elias was the one studying them. And on that night, he did not begin with violence. He began with severance, cutting the mansion off from the world, thread by thread. He slipped into the root cellar first, extinguishing the oil lamps and locking the hatch from the outside. The servants' passages, narrow wooden arteries running beneath the mansion, became choke points. He sealed them silently. He knew the floorboards well enough to step between the planks that groaned. He knew which hinges had been oiled and which hadn't. He knew where shadows gathered thickest. Then he climbed upward. No lantern, no weapon, just a resolve sharpened to something near supernatural. He moved through the corridors like a ghost reclaiming a debt. The mansion's ancient beams shuddered, as if an old structure built on centuries of cruelty finally sensed a reckoning approaching. What happened next begins the true descent into the forbidden truth they tried to bury, the part that unsettled even the officials who survived long enough to record fragments. The first to sense him was not a person, but the mansion itself. Old houses develop a kind of memory. They remember every whisper, every cruelty, every hidden ritual performed in the dark corners where reputation cannot reach. Greyridge had absorbed decades of broken wills and muffled cries, and the wooden bones of the structure still carried their echoes. Elias felt them. They guided him like currents beneath a black ocean. At the top of the staircase, the air changed. Warmer, still, dense, like a room holding its breath. This was the eastern wing, the family's sanctuary, a place forbidden to every servant except on chore days, and even then only under surveillance. No one entered without permission. No one left without being noticed. But tonight, Elias walked through its threshold with a calmness so complete it looked like inevitability wearing the face of a man. He paused at the landing, listening, not with ears, but with instinct sharpened through years of knowing danger before it spoke. Behind each closed door, he could sense their presence, the master's sons asleep, the wife and daughters restless from a winter storm pressing against the windows, the master himself awake in his study, writing another entry into the journal he believed history would one day celebrate. Elias knew better. The journal wasn't a monument. It was a confession. It detailed the methods Thaddeus Gray perfected, how he trained obedience through fear, how he manipulated loyalty through deprivation, how he engineered silence through psychological compression. He wrote proudly about domination as an art, about reshaping men into tools. But in his arrogance, he forgot the simplest truth. Tools remember the hands that forged them. Elias stepped toward the first door. He didn't need to open it. Not yet. Tonight was not about rushing from room to room in chaos. Tonight was about balance. He moved instead to the hallway lanterns, each filled with clear oil, each hung at perfect intervals, each meant to keep the corridors illuminated through the night. Thaddeus preferred his home bright, believing darkness gave fear too much room to breathe. Elias disagreed. He lifted the metal lids one by one, quietly removing the wicks. Without them, the lanterns would burn out prematurely. Without light, the mansion became a labyrinth of shadows, his territory, not theirs. The flames flickered, shrank, and died. One by one, the whole descended into blackness. Elias exhaled once, steady and slow. The night was his now. When the last lantern surrendered to darkness, the mansion seemed to revert to an older version of itself, something primal, something true. Without light, without order, the polished civilization of the Gray household peeled away. The portraits along the walls, painted to honor lineage and nobility, now became looming silhouettes with hollow eyes. The fine wooden paneling felt less like craftsmanship, and more like the ribcage of a beast that had swallowed too many lives whole. Elias walked through it without hesitation. There are moments in a man's life when fear stops being an enemy and becomes an instrument. Most never reach that point. But Elias had lived in the underbelly of this mansion long enough to understand its psychology better than the family that owned it. He knew that darkness does not confuse a man who has memorized it. It only confuses the ones who rely on power granted by daylight. And the Gray family were creatures of daylight. Down the corridor, the first sound finally broke the mansion's oppressive silence. Soft movement behind a door. The shifting of someone half asleep, unaware that the world around them had already begun to tilt into something irreversible. Elias did not approach the rooms yet. The family was not his first target. No, he moved toward the master. Thaddeus Gray kept his study at the far end of the east wing, behind a double oak door sealed with brass locks he believed was symbolic of his authority. But Elias knew something Thaddeus never realized. The locks were for show. For visitors. For the illusion of intellectual sanctity. Behind the doors, the master kept his true implements, not just books, but tools of mental training, diagrams of punishment cycles, records of broken spirits. He listed the way accountants list expenses. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Inside was a small iron key. A servant's key. One Thaddeus never noticed was missing. It fit the lock perfectly. But Elias did not turn it. Not yet. Because something else captured his attention. A draft of frigid air sliding across the floorboards, brushing against his ankles. Winter winds could not penetrate the masonry this deeply. No window was open in the east wing. This chill was not natural. It came from the center of the mansion, from a vent that ran directly above the old family crypt beneath the foundations. It was as if something down there exhaled. Something waiting. Elias understood then that the night was not unfolding by his hand alone. The mansion itself had joined him. The draft crawling up from the family crypt was colder than winter should ever be. It had weight to it, intention, as if something buried beneath generations of gray lineage was staring at the scent of fear drifting through the mansion's walls. Elias paused, letting the breath of the crypt move around him, letting it speak in its own way. Old structures whisper, but old graves, they remember. The Gray family had always forbidden the enslaved from going near the crypt. Not out of respect for the dead. Thaddeus Gray had no respect for anything he couldn't use, but because the crypt was not a place to honor ancestors. It was a vault of secrets. A chamber where the earliest Grays practiced rituals of control they imported from older, darker European traditions. These rituals weren't just about discipline, they were about conditioning obedience through symbolic fear, binding minds, not just bodies. Elias had heard fragments over the years. Rumors, whispers, stories meant to intimidate. But he also knew something the Grays didn't realize. Fear loses its power the moment a man walks directly into it. He rested a hand against the study door again. Behind it, Thaddeus was awake, scraping his quill across another page, shaping another delusion of grandeur. Elias could almost hear him muttering, rehearsing speeches he'd never give, histories he'd never live to see. The master believed his words would outlive him. Tonight, Elias intended to prove him wrong. But that cold breath from the crypt still lingered at Elias's heels, urging him downward, as if the mansion wanted him to see something first, something foundational to all the corruption that had grown from this family tree. He weighed the choices. Confront the master now, or descend into the place where the Gray dynasty planted its roots in Fae. A distant creak answered for him. Not the creak of footsteps. Not a door. Not a window. It was the slow, groaning exhale of the house itself, settling under the weight of what was coming, as though preparing a stage long overdue for judgment. A second creak followed. This one was closer. And another. They weren't random noises. They were signals. The floorboards along the main hall were shifting under someone's weight. Someone rising from sleep, confused by the sudden darkness, stepping carefully, uncertain. The family was waking up. Elias turned his back to the study door and faced the corridor instead. The time for the descent into the crypt would come. But Feist, the house was calling him elsewhere. The footsteps were faint at first, hesitant, unsteady. The sound of someone trying to make sense of a darkness that should not have existed. Elias could tell immediately that it wasn't Thaddeus. The master's stride was heavy, confident, even at night. This was the sound of someone softer. Someone who had lived under the illusion of protection, one of the heirs. The Gray sons were raised differently than their father. Not kinder, just sheltered from the mechanics of their own privilege. They enjoyed the house, but they did not understand the invisible machinery that kept it functioning. They had never walked through the servants' halls, never seen the bruised palms that prepared their meals, never noticed the quiet desperation hiding behind every "yes, sir." Elias moved silently to the center of the hall, letting his body blend into the shadows. He positioned himself near the wall where moonlight could not reach. The footsteps grew closer, followed by the faint glow of a handheld candle weaving through the dark. A thin, wavering flame cut through the black. The youngest son, Samuel Gray, emerged from around the corner, half-dressed, hair disheveled, face caught between sleep and unease. He held the candle high, blinking at the extinguished lanterns with confusion. "Hello," he whispered. The word quivered. It was not a command. It was a plea. Elias stayed silent. Samuel took another step, squinting into the dark. "Is someone there?" Elias watched him carefully. Samuel had never harmed anyone directly. But innocence in a corrupt house is rarely true innocence. It is complicity woven into comfort. Samuel had benefited from every ounce of suffering the mansion produced. The food he ate, the luxuries he enjoyed, the dreams he pursued. They were built on the broken backs of people whose names he never bothered to learn. Still, Elias did not move toward him. Not yet. Tonight was not about rage. Tonight was architecture, a dismantling of the Gray dynasty layer by layer, like removing keystones from a foundation until the entire edifice collapses under its own moral rot. Samuel. Step closer. He reached for a lantern on the wall, shaking it gently as if hoping flame might magically reappear. It didn't. Instead, the faint breeze from the crypt drifted up again, colder this time, brushing against Samuel's candle flame. The wick fluttered violently. Elias realized what the mansion wanted. It wanted fear to take root in the family before anything else happened. Because fear is the first fracture. Samuel's candle sputtered, wavered, died. The hallway plunged into absolute darkness. Samuel inhaled sharply, his breath trembling. Elias took one step forward. The night was entering its next phase. Samuel's breath quivered in the dark like a thread drawn too tight. He wasn't used to silence, true silence, the kind that strips a man's confidence down to its bones. The Grey Sons had lived their entire lives inside a fortress of light, order, and inherited authority. Darkness leveled them. Darkness erased their place in the hierarchy. In darkness, every man stands alone. Elias let the quiet stretch, not to torment him, but to teach him. Fear isn't created by threats. Fear is created by possibilities. Samuel took a half step backward, his bare heel scraping the floor. "Who's there?" he whispered again, slightly louder, slightly more fragile. Elias didn't respond. Instead, he allowed the mansion to answer for him. A low groan echoed through the rafters, ancient with shifting under the weight of memory. Then another, deeper and more resonant, like a warning from the bones of the house itself. Samuel spun toward the sound, hand outstretched, searching blindly for a wall. His fingers grazed the wallpaper. He exhaled with relief. But the relief didn't last, because the cold draft from the crypt rose again, sliding between the floorboards, hardly noticeable except for one thing. Samuel felt it. He shivered violently and whispered, Someone opened a window." But no window was open. Elias knew that. The house knew that. This was not a breeze. This was an invitation from below, a reminder of everything the Grey family built their power upon. Samuel backed away from the center of the hole, trying to orient himself in the dark. But he misjudged the distance. His shoulder struck a pedestal, rattling a porcelain bust that had sat untouched for decades. It crashed to the floor, shattering into a dozen white fragments. Samuel gasped, not because of the noise, but because he realized something. No one came running. No servants. No guards. No family. He was alone in the dark. The first real fear entered his body then. Not panic, but comprehension. For the first time in his life, the mansion did not answer to him. For the first time, his voice did not summon obedience. For the first time, he felt what everyone else had felt living under the Grey name, vulnerability. Elias stepped forward again, silent as a closing door. This time, Samuel sensed him. A sharp inhale. A tremble of recognition. A whispered, "Please, don't." But Elias wasn't here to harm him. Not yet. Everything had an order. And Samuel was merely the first ripple in a much deeper current. The true confrontation waited behind the oak doors at the far end of the hall. Thaddeus Gray was still awake. Elias left Samuel frozen in the hallway, a boy trapped in the sudden gravity of reality. The young heir was neither broken nor dead yet, but his understanding of control had begun to fracture. That was enough. Fear, carefully applied, is more instructive than violence. And in this house, lessons are never gentle. He turned toward the master's study. The double oak doors stood at the end of the corridor like a final threshold between order and chaos, authority and reckoning. Every step he took echoed faintly, but it was the mansion that carried the sound, soft groans and creaks like the building itself was counting him forward. Old houses remember, old houses watch, and some old houses wait. Grayridge waited, and it was patient. Elias touched the cold brass handles of the study doors. They were smooth from years of routine, polished to symbolize power. Thaddeus Gray believed a locked door could protect him, but he never understood that fear and secrecy are brittle, especially when the hand that wields them is no longer yours. He paused. He could hear the scratching of the quill inside, the meticulous, obsessive sounds of a man trying to preserve himself in ink. The master's mind was fully engaged in his own narrative, oblivious to the larger story unfolding around him. This is the arrogance of power, to believe the world revolves around your vigilance, your plans, your rules. It is the arrogance that ensures a tyrant's downfall. Elias inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every year of observation, every insult endured, every unseen injustice. Tonight was not spontaneous. It was inevitable. Every calculated action, every stolen opportunity, Every discarded rule of the Grey estate had led to this night. The mansion seemed to bend around him as he inserted the key. The lock clicked with a quiet finality that sounded louder than any shout. He turned the handle slowly. Not to announce himself. Not yet. But to remind the master that authority was fragile, that domination is only as strong as the belief in it, and belief can die in a single, quiet instant. The doors opened. Darkness spilled in, swallowing the study like it had swallowed the hallways. The candlelight from Thaddeus's desk flickered weakly against the walls, throwing long, distorted shadows that trembled across the bookshelves. Elias stepped inside, a silhouette against the faint light. He did not speak. The master did not look up. He continued writing, unknowing that his empire of fear had already begun to crumble around him. And in that silent confrontation, one truth became undeniable. The house, the bloodline, the tyranny, all of it was vulnerable. The time for reckoning had arrived. Thaddeus Gray did not hear the footsteps at first. His mind was buried in numbers, in lists of obedience, in charts that mapped human behavior as if life itself were a ledger to balance. But the air shifted. He felt it before he saw it. A presence. Heavy, deliberate, unseen. And instinctively, his fingers froze on the quill. The master's eyes darted up, scanning the shadows, but he saw nothing. And why would he? Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The room was still. But the mansion whispered, subtle vibrations through the floorboards, the walls, even the books on the shelves. Elias was already inside, yet Thaddeus could not perceive him. He only felt the weight of inevitability. Elias took a measured step, watching the master's routine unravel without a word. The brilliance of tyranny, the elegance of psychological control, depends on predictability. And predictability was gone. The master's mind flickered between confusion and fear, a dangerous combination that left him exposed in ways brute force never could. Thaddeus rose, finally, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He tried to command the room, his voice faint but shaking. "Who's there? Show yourself." Elias remained silent. He did not need to speak. His presence alone was enough to tilt the balance of power. The mansion itself seemed to bend toward him, shadows stretching unnaturally, floorboards groaning as if affirming allegiance. Every object in the study, the ornate desk, the thick curtains, the iron-bound books, held the story of years of oppression. And now, every element was poised to betray the Grey dynasty. The master reached for a candlestick, a feeble attempt at defense. But Elias did not move to strike. He allowed the weight of anticipation to do the work. He understood something vital. Fear, properly administered, is far deadlier than steel. It infiltrates the mind before the body, breaking defenses long before a hand is laid upon it. Thaddeus's breathing quickened. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He realized too late that he had never truly controlled the house. He had only controlled its inhabitants. And Elias had mastered the environment itself. Every shadow, every corridor, every beam of old would now answer to him. In that moment, Thaddeus Gray understood the fundamental truth about power. It is fragile. It is conditional. And when it is stripped away by a force patient, intelligent, and relentless, all the trappings of dominion, wealth, lineage, reputation, are reduced to ashes. And soon, the mansion itself would burn. The fire was never Elias's first move. The flames were the punctuation at the end of a sentence that had been written for decades. The mansion, with all its secrets and histories, had to be dismantled from the inside out before it could be set aflame. He started at the foundation, at the hidden corridors, at the vents that carried the cold breath of the crypt upward. Every corner of Greyridge had been mapped in his mind, every weakness catalogued. Thaddeus Gray's panic was no longer theoretical. He moved frantically across the study, knocking over books, trying to understand how the house had betrayed him so thoroughly. But the betrayal was not accidental. It was precise. It was inevitable. Elias had studied the rhythms of fear, the mechanics of psychological control, and now he was using them against the master who had once wielded them so cruelly. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of fire and smoke. Elias had taken precautions to ensure the mansion could not be saved. He opened hidden channels in the subfloor, releasing a flammable mixture that had been prepared over months, smuggled into the estate unnoticed. Each room had a secret conduit, a path that would allow the flames to consume the house in a pattern of his design, efficient, complete, total. And still, he did not strike Thaddeus. The master was already unraveling. His mind raced in fragmented patterns, trying to predict, to control, to bargain. Every attempt failed. The very principles he had built his life upon, hierarchy, obedience, fear, were collapsing before him. He realized, too late, that a single man who understood the machinery of oppression could dismantle it from within. Elias stepped closer, letting the master see the calm in his eyes. Not hatred, not vengeance, simply inevitability. You built a house on fear, Elias said softly. But fear is only useful until it meets someone who does not bend. Thaddeus's hand shook as he tried to reach for the desk, for the quill, for some remnant of power. But it was gone. The mansion had already chosen its side. Shadows lengthened, moving unnaturally, as if the structure itself was alive, aligning with Elias. Outside, smoke began to curl from the edges of the estate. A single spark, ignited in a hidden shaft, would soon reach every room. Every secret, every hidden corridor, every legacy of cruelty the Gray family had nurtured. And in the center of it all, Elias remained still, patient, calculated, untouchable. By the time the first roar of flames reached the upper floors, there would be no escape, no redemption, no mercy. The mansion groaned as the fire began to claim it, but Elias moved with the precision of a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Smoke curled through the corridors like serpents, seeking the cracks and crevices that had sheltered the Gray family for generations. The old wood hissed as the heat crept upward, consuming centuries of arrogance, rituals, and secrets. Thaddeus Gray stumbled backward, his face ghostly in the flickering light of the distant flames. He tried to command the servants, though most had fled at the first sign of chaos, but their obedience had already died long ago. What remained of the household's hierarchy crumbled in an instant. No one came. No one could. Elias had stripped the mansion of every layer of defense, leaving only the skeleton of fear and a single master trapped within. Elias watched the master, noting the frantic attempts to rationalize the impossible. Thaddeus's mind was calculating escape routes, locked doors, hidden stairwells, but the calculations were irrelevant. Every passage had been anticipated, every barrier accounted for. The mansion itself seemed to guide Elias, responding to him as though it had been waiting for this night for centuries. From the crypt below, a draught of cold air rose again, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang, the scent of history bleeding through stone and mortar. It reminded Elias of why he had waited so long, why patience had been his most powerful weapon. Power, when accumulated, can be destroyed just as easily as it is built. And the Gray dynasty, built on generations of terror, arrogance, and greed, was nothing if not accumulated power. Thaddeus, now cornered against the desk, realized the futility of his situation. His mind, trained to dominate others, had never prepared him to be outmatched by intelligence, precision, and understanding. Elias had mastered the mansion, mastered the corridors, mastered the shadows. The master's empire of fear had been reduced to ash before the fire even reached the upper floors. Elias spoke once more, his voice low, deliberate. You taught others to obey through terror. Now you will understand what it feels like to be powerless. Not because I strike you, but because everything you built will vanish before your eyes. The first walls began to catch, the flames lapping hungrily at the edges of the heavy oak panels. Smoke thickened, turning the upper corridors into a maze of shadows and heat. The mansion had begun to die, and in the center of it all, Elias remained unshaken, a calm force amidst chaos, a man who understood the machinery of fear better than anyone who had ever wielded it. The fire grew faster than Thaddeus could comprehend, consuming the mansion in waves that licked the ceilings and shrieked along the walls. Smoke filled the corridors, taining air thick and suffocating, bending perception. The master's once commanding voice now cracked in panic, echoing through the empty hallways. He shouted for servants, for sons, for anything to save him, but the echoes returned only as hollow reminders of isolation. Elias observed quietly, his presence unshakable. Every step the flames took, every crackling beam, reinforced the inevitability he had engineered. This was not random destruction. This was precision, a meticulous dismantling of a dynasty built on fear and the illusion of control. The mansion was teaching its master the lesson he had spent a lifetime denying to others: power, no matter how absolute it seems, is conditional. And when it fails, all the prestige, wealth, and lineage vanish like smoke. The mansion itself seemed alive, groaning and twisting under the assault of fire. The shadows danced, elongating across walls, creeping through the corridors like dark fingers reclaiming the spaces that had been tainted by oppression. Elias could feel the history embedded in the beams, the floors, the ceilings, memories of every injustice that had ever occurred within these walls. And now, for the first time, the house served justice. Thaddeus attempted to flee, stumbling over broken furniture and debris. He tried to force doors open, to escape through secret passages, but each path led him back toward the center of his crumbling empire. Elias had anticipated everything, leaving the master trapped not through violence, but through understanding the architecture of fear and confinement. The mansion itself had become a weapon in Elias's hands. Outside, the night carried the smell of burning timber and the bitter tang of ash. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke over the surrounding lands, as if announcing to the world that the gray legacy was being obliterated. In the center of the chaos, Elias finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost reverent. This is what happens when cruelty is cultivated as a philosophy. Every system of oppression has a breaking point. Every tyrant faces the reckoning they create for others. Thaddeus sank to the floor, coughing, defeated, helpless. The mansion's walls shook with the fury of the fire, as though the house itself were exhaling a final judgment. In that instant, Elias knew that nothing would ever recover the power the Greys had wielded here. And yet, the night was far from over. The mansion would burn fully, and with it, the lessons buried in silence would be etched into memory forever. The mansion roared now, a living entity in pain, folding in on itself as flames clawed through the rafters. Windows shattered under the heat, sending shards into the black night. Smoke poured out like a river of shadows, obscuring stars, suffocating the air, hiding the final moments of a dynasty that had believed itself untouchable. Elias did not panic. He moved with purpose through the corridors he had mapped so meticulously, guiding the fire toward the heart of the Grey family's power, the central hall. This was where their decisions had been made, where cruelty had been codified into law, where fear had been sharpened into a weapon and deployed against everyone beneath their roof. Every splintering wall, every collapsing beam, every roar of timber was a signal that the system was being dismantled, not piece by piece, but entirely. Thaddeus Grey crawled, coughing and blinded by smoke, desperate to salvage some fragment of his authority. Elias watched silently, noting the desperation that fear had once brought him now turned inward. No one came to his aid. The servants had fled. The sons were paralyzed with terror in the hallways. Even the mansion itself refused to shelter him now. It had joined Elias, the arbiter of retribution. Elias paused in the doorway to the central hall and allowed the full weight of the moment to settle over him. In history, there are rare nights when one man can rewrite the destiny of a family, and this was one of them. He could almost feel the centuries of oppression lifting from the floorboards, the walls, the ceilings. Each crack in the plaster, each bending timber, each collapsing beam carried the echo of lives stifled, silenced, and broken. Thaddeus moaned, the sound swallowed by the fire. Elias could see the reality sinking in. The life of control, the accumulation of power, the arrogance that had built the Grey dynasty, gone. Not through war, not through armies, but through precision, intelligence, and patience. Every lesson the master had ever attempted to teach through fear had now been reflected back, a mirror of inevitability he could not escape. Outside, the surrounding trees shivered as the heat pushed outward, painting the night with smoke and red light. The wind carried the smell of destruction, of history being rewritten in real time. And Elias, standing in the shadow of flames and ruin, understood the deeper truth of the night. This was not mere vengeance. It was a lesson, a signal, a declaration that oppression, no matter how deeply rooted, always has its breaking point. The mansion had begun to collapse inward, and with it, the myth of the Grey dynasty was falling into ashes. The mansion groaned as its skeleton gave way, each floor collapsing into the one below with a deafening crash. Flames danced hungrily, devouring every ornament, every symbol of status, every record of cruelty. Smoke surged through the holes in waves, black and choking, a tangible reminder that the Grey legacy would leave nothing behind but ash and memory. Elias walked through the shadows as the mansion tore itself apart. He was not afraid of the fire. He had accounted for every path, every vent, every ember. This night was a test of understanding, of precision, patience, and psychology. The flames were not an enemy, they were a tool. They amplified the lesson, the terror, the inevitability that Thaddeus Gray now faced in full. The master's moans echoed through the burning corridors. His hands were raw from clawing at doors, his lungs scorched from smoke, his mind unraveling with every crack, groan, and collapse of the structure he had spent decades perfecting. Thaddeus realized, too late, that power is not inherited. It is constructed moment by moment, and it can be dismantled in the same way. Elias did not speak. He let the mansion do the talking. Every roar of timber, every shattering window, every snapping beam communicated the consequence of cruelty and the fragility of domination. The house, once a symbol of wealth and fear, had become an instrument of reckoning. Outside, the flames licked the night sky, the orange glow cutting through the darkness like a warning to anyone who might one day attempt similar tyranny. Smoke swirled over the estate, carrying with it the weight of centuries of secrets, oppression, and unspoken horror. The wind seemed to acknowledge the balance of the world being restored, whispering through the trees as if nature itself bore witness. Thaddeus finally collapsed onto the floor of the central hall, coughing violently. His mind, trained for control, could not comprehend the methodical unraveling of his empire. He had built his life on obedience and fear, yet now both had turned against him. The mansion, his creation, now served Elias entirely. The master had become a prisoner of the very system he had used to dominate others. Elias took one last look around the hall, noting the perfect symmetry of destruction. Every plan, every calculation, every psychological lever had been executed with surgical precision. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a statement, a warning, a monument to the consequences of unchecked power. And somewhere in the depths of the burning estate, the first true silence of understanding settled over Thaddeus Gray. A lesson too late, a life without redemption, a legacy that would be remembered only as ashes. By now, the mansion was an inferno, a cathedral of destruction consuming itself in deliberate, unstoppable motion. Flames shot through the rafters, licking the walls where portraits of Gray ancestors had once hung, their painted eyes now consumed in the fire's hungry glare. Every structural beam, every carved banister, every luxurious carpet, symbols of decades of power and oppression, was being erased in real time. Elias walked calmly through the edge of the smoke, a phantom navigating chaos. The mansion had been meticulously studied, every secret corridor mapped, every hidden vent and escape route accounted for. But the fire was not just destruction, it was amplification. It illuminated fear in a way darkness alone could not. It revealed how fragile control really was. Thaddeus Gray tried to rise, but the smoke burned his lungs and the heat forced him back to the floor. His empire, once seemingly eternal, had no defense against patience, knowledge, and precision. Each beam that fell, each window that shattered, each wall that buckled was a reminder that tyranny is never absolute. It can be dismantled systematically, carefully, with intellect and timing, lessons Elias had learned in silence over many years. The youngest son, Samuel, remained paralyzed in the hallways. He had witnessed enough to understand that the world they had built on fear and privilege was collapsing, and he could do nothing to stop it. The illusion of safety, of inherited authority, had been shattered in the space of one night. Fear had a new master. Elias paused in the center of the burning hall, observing the symmetry of the devastation. He could feel the mansion vibrating beneath his feet, almost as if it were alive, acknowledging the precision of his plan. Every shadow, every crack, every ember carried a lesson, that the mighty can fall when their dominion relies solely on fear, that silence can be more dangerous than rebellion, that knowledge and patience are the weapons the powerful never anticipate. He spoke once, his voice low, deliberate, almost reverent. Power built on oppression is an illusion. Every system has its breaking point. Every tyrant will one day confront it. And when they do, nothing, not wealth, not lineage, not walls, can protect them. The mansion's roof groaned under the heat, the fire consuming every last hidden corner. Smoke filled the sky, a dark banner signaling the end of the Gray dynasty. The house was no longer a home. It had become a statement of inevitable justice. Outside, the wind carried the flames farther, as though even nature conspired to erase the symbols of cruelty. Elias stood amid the destruction, calm and unshaken, a man who had turned patience, observation, and strategy into instruments of reckoning. The night had begun with silence. It would end with ashes. The smoke rose in thick, curling columns, carrying the scent of charred wood, melted metal, and centuries of suppressed cruelty. Elias stepped back into the shadows of the estate's outer corridors, watching the mansion convulse under the heat. Flames burst through the windows in waves, and the roof, long supported by decades of meticulous carpentry, began to collapse inward, sending showers of sparks into the night. The structure that had symbolized absolute control was now a skeleton of ash and flame. Inside, Thaddeus Gray's moans were weaker now, carried faintly through the collapsing holes. He had lost everything that gave his life meaning: authority, security, the illusion of immortality. The mansion, the very vessel of his power, had become a weapon against him. Every floorboard, every wall, every shuttered window had betrayed the tyrant in precise coordination. Elias had not rushed. That was the point. Precision mattered more than speed. A tyrant accustomed to control cannot learn from chaos. He only learns when the mechanisms of his dominance are turned against him methodically. Samuel Gray had understood this earlier in the night, the first flicker of fear, but the master had resisted until reality, amplified by fire, finally forced comprehension. Outside, the wind tugged at Elias's coat, carrying the rising smoke across the surrounding lands. For miles, the scent of destruction would linger. Animals would flee. Travelers would remember the fire in the forest beyond. Even the earth seemed to recognize the scale of what had been wrought. The Gray estate had been more than a house. It was a fortress of control, a monument to oppression. And now it was reduced to ash, a cautionary relic. Elias stepped toward the mansion's front entrance, pausing at the scorched steps. He could feel the heat against his skin, a reminder of the intensity required to execute such a plan. He had moved through every corridor, anticipated every reaction, manipulated every element of fear, and now watched as the natural consequence unfolded. In that moment, he understood the deeper truth of what he had done. The act was not vengeance. It was education. The family, the mansion, the dynasty, they had all been instruments to reveal an immutable law. Power, when wielded through fear alone, will always create the conditions for its own destruction. And as the fire consumed the remaining walls, Elias felt the full weight of history shift. Tonight would be remembered, whispered, feared, and studied, but only by those who understood that survival requires more than strength. It requires patience, calculation, and the courage to confront systems far larger than oneself. The fire had consumed half the mansion now, but Elias moved as if through a quiet storm. He was not driven by anger, nor by satisfaction. He was guided by understanding, a clarity that comes from years of observation, endurance, and calculated patience. Every creaking beam, every collapsing wall, every wisp of smoke was confirmation that his plan had unfolded precisely as intended. Thaddeus Gray struggled in the ruins, coughing, blind, deafened by the roar of destruction. He had always relied on systems, schedules, routines, the predictable obedience of those around him. But tonight, every system had been inverted. The house, once a sanctuary of control, had become an instrument of reckoning, and the master, for the first time, confronted the full weight of vulnerability. Samuel Gray, paralyzed earlier in the hallway, had now begun to stumble, trying to find a safe corner in the inferno. Elias observed from the shadows, a silent guide. Samuel's fear was palpable but incomplete. He had glimpsed the fragility of authority, but he had yet to understand its depth. That lesson would remain with him for the rest of his life, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. The mansion groaned and shifted, the fire following its own unpredictable logic, yet guided entirely by the vulnerabilities Elias had studied. Windows shattered, beams snapped, and walls collapsed in a precise rhythm. Each destruction amplified the psychological weight on the family trapped within. The estate was no longer a home. It was a crucible. Elias paused in the hall leading to the central staircase. He could feel the heat pressing against his back, the suffocating smoke curling around his legs. Yet he moved with deliberate calm. Fire, like fear, obeys the one who understands it. He had mastered both tonight. He glanced back at Thaddeus. The master's once imperious demeanor had evaporated entirely. Now he was a man stripped of illusion, staring at the collapse of a life built on dominance. Elias had not needed to strike a single blow. The architecture of oppression had undone itself under the weight of precise manipulation, patience, and inevitability. Outside, the night was alive with smoke and sparks. The surrounding forest was bathed in a fiery glow, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the estate. The world would remember this night, not the faces of the perpetrators, but the lesson of the collapse. The Grey dynasty, a family once synonymous with fear and control, was being erased. Elias inhaled slowly, feeling the resonance of the house in its destruction. The fire was almost complete. And soon, every wall, every floor, every secret that had been hidden within those holes would exist only as ashes, an eternal monument to the consequences of tyranny. The central hole, once the pinnacle of the Grey family's power, was now a furnace of collapse and shadow. Flames shot upward, consuming ornate molding, chandeliers, and the remnants of carpets that had been carefully maintained for decades. Smoke twisted into the rafters like serpents, suffocating the space with the scent of charred wood and ruined legacy. The mansion was no longer a house, it was a mechanism of judgment, and Elias was its conductor. Thaddeus Gray clawed at the floor, desperate for escape, his mind fracturing under the weight of the inferno. His years of control, his meticulous planning, every strategy of dominance he had spent a lifetime perfecting, gone. Each crack of timber, each collapse of plaster, reinforced the truth he had ignored for decades. Fear only works on those who believe it is eternal. And the moment someone understands the rules, the system itself can be turned against its creator. Samuel Gray stumbled through the corridors, coughing and disoriented, feeling the heat press against his body like the hands of judgment themselves. He had glimpsed the fragility of his family's empire earlier, but now he confronted its full reality. The mansion, the fire, the chaos, all had combined into a lesson in inevitability. And the lesson was unmistakable. Privilege built on oppression is not protection. It is a trap. Elias moved quietly through the smoke, guiding his own path with the precision of someone who knew every hidden conduit, every secret vent, every structural weakness. He had orchestrated this night with patience and intelligence. Violence alone could never have achieved this outcome. The mansion's destruction was a mirror to the internal collapse of its occupants, a psychological dismantling executed in tandem with physical annihilation. Outside, the wind carried embers into the surrounding forest, painting the night with streaks of fiery orange. The estate's reputation, once a symbol of dominance, would be replaced by a cautionary legend. Anyone who heard the story in years to come would understand the power of patience, knowledge, and meticulous planning against tyranny. Elias paused at the doorway to the collapsed staircase, feeling the vibrations of the mansion's final throes under his feet. He did not need to strike Thaddeus. The fire, the fear, and the inevitability had already done their work. The master's empire, once absolute, had been dismantled piece by piece, not by force, but by strategy and understanding. As the heat pressed outward, Elias looked toward the sky. The flames consumed the mansion, but they also illuminated the principle that would haunt every future tyrant. Control built on fear is never permanent. The mansion was burning, and the Grey dynasty would never rise again. The fire had reached its zenith. The upper floors sagged and splintered, chandeliers crashed, and the smoke had thickened into a suffocating veil that turned every shadow into a living threat. Elias moved with deliberate calm, each step measured, each breath controlled. This was not chaos. It was orchestration. Every collapse, every row of timber, every plume of smoke had been anticipated and directed. Thaddeus Gray lay near the remnants of his once grand desk, coughing violently, eyes wide with disbelief. He had been so certain of his invincibility, so reliant on the systems he had built, that he could not comprehend the precision of his downfall. Fear, he realized too late, could be engineered against him with the same meticulousness he had once employed to dominate others. Samuel Gray stumbled closer, clutching his chest, his face streaked with soot and sweat. The youngest son had lived his life insulated by privilege and obedience, and yet the mansion, now transformed into a furnace of reckoning, taught him a lesson far beyond the grasp of any tutor or parent. That power is conditional, and fear alone is a fragile fortress. The fire did not discriminate. It did not choose. It simply revealed the truth. Elias paused in the center of the hole, letting the heat wash over him, letting the mansion demonstrate the inevitability of its collapse. He could hear the groans of timber surrendering under the fire's relentless advance, the walls cracking like bones, the ceilings bowing toward their ultimate fate. Every element of the estate, the corridors, the hidden chambers, the ventilation shafts, was now an active participant in the unraveling of the Grey Dynasty. Outside, embers floated into the night like sparks of warning. The wind carried the scent of destruction, of history being rewritten in flames. Across the surrounding lands, anyone who saw the glow would feel the warning. Cruelty, no matter how meticulously constructed, has a price that is inevitably paid. Elias finally spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the roar of the fire. Every system of oppression creates the conditions for its own destruction. Every tyrant teaches the methods by which he can be undone. And every family that rules through fear will one day confront the consequences they have carefully ignored. The mansion continued to collapse, walls folding inward, floor splitting beneath the weight of decades of arrogance. Smoke spiraled skyward, a testament to inevitability, a monument to precision. Thaddeus Gray's empire had ended, and Elias, standing amid shadows and fire, understood fully that control can be unmade, not by chaos, but by the patient, deliberate application of knowledge, timing, and understanding. The flames devoured the last of the upper floors, consuming the opulent furniture, the gilded frames, and the symbols of Grey authority that had once commanded respect and obedience. Smoke poured into the night sky like black rivers, twisting, thickening, obscuring the stars. Elias stood at the edge of the hole, observing the house's final throes, unmoved by the inferno. For him, this was not destruction, it was revelation. Thaddeus Gray lay crumpled on the scorched floor, coughing, choking on smoke, his eyes wide with terror. For the first time, he understood that power was fragile. Authority could crumble with the precision of intelligence, patience, and the subtle manipulation of perception. He had built his life upon systems of fear, yet every system he had relied upon had been anticipated, inverted, and neutralized. He had trained others to obey, but he had never trained himself for the inevitability of being outmatched. Samuel Gray stumbled into the hole, blinking through tears and smoke. He had seen his father's empire crumble piece by piece. He had seen the mansion, the ultimate symbol of their family's power, turned into a crucible of destruction. And he understood, even if only instinctively, that privilege built on oppression is never permanent. It can be dismantled silently, surgically, with patience and knowledge. Elias finally stepped fully into the central hole, the heat pressing against him, the roar of the flames echoing like a chorus of judgment. Every structural collapse, every crack, every shattering of glass was a lesson. Fear can be engineered, manipulated, and ultimately weaponized against the one who once wielded it. The house itself had become a conduit for justice, responding to the intelligence and precision of the man who had studied it for months. Outside, embers floated into the night, carried by the wind, spreading the story of the Grey estate's collapse to the surrounding lands. It was more than a fire. It was a signal, a cautionary tale that power maintained through fear is always temporary, and that even the mightiest tyrants can be undone by strategy and patience. Elias spoke once, his voice calm but deliberate. Every dynasty built on oppression sows the seeds of its own destruction. Every tyrant creates the blueprint of their downfall. And tonight, the mansion has delivered its judgment. The mansion groaned one last time, timber and stone surrendering to flame. In that moment, the Grey dynasty ceased to exist, not in rumor, not in legend, but in ash. And Elias, standing amid the smoke and ruin, knew the night would echo forever as a lesson in the fragility of power and the inevitability of reckoning. The mansion's collapse accelerated. Beams snapped like brittle bones, and the upper floors gave way with thunderous crashes. Smoke thickened, curling through broken windows and doors, carrying the acrid scent of charred timber and scorched memories. Elias remained calm, moving with deliberate intention, almost a part of the destruction itself. This was no chaotic fire. It was a symphony of inevitability, orchestrated with precision and patience. Thaddeus Gray crawled toward the far wall, coughing violently, eyes wide in disbelief. The empire he had spent a lifetime cultivating, walls, corridors, hidden passages, and rituals of control, had failed him utterly. The systems he had relied upon to maintain order and obedience had turned against him, dismantled by a single mind that understood the mechanics of fate. The mansion, once a fortress, had become an instrument of his undoing. Samuel Gray stumbled down a corridor, shaking and coughing, witnessing the full magnitude of the collapse. His world, built on privilege and the illusion of security, was gone. The fire did not discriminate. It burned through walls, furniture, and status alike. Every crack, every splinter, every roar of collapsing timber revealed the vulnerability of power that depends entirely on fear. Elias paused in the central hall, listening to the mansion's groans. The fire had consumed nearly every wall, every floor, every symbol of the Gray dynasty. And yet the lesson was still unfolding. The destruction was not just physical, it was psychological, an education in inevitability. The flames had become a mirror, reflecting every act of cruelty, every abuse of power, and every secret the family had buried in silence. Outside, embers were carried on the wind, scattering into the surrounding forest. They lit the night sky with warning sparks, a visual testament to the collapse of a dynasty built on oppression. Anyone who witnessed it would feel the weight of the lesson, even if they did not fully understand it. Absolute power founded on fear is temporary, and the higher one builds, the harder one falls. Elias spoke softly, his voice cutting through the roar of the inferno. Every structure built on oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. Every master who believes themselves untouchable will one day face the inevitability they have created. Tonight, the mansion has delivered its judgment. The central hall sagged, the roof collapsing inward. Smoke choked the remaining corridors, and the mansion's last defiant structures groaned under the heat. The Gray dynasty, once untouchable, was now reduced to ash and lesson, a story of inevitability, patience, and the unrelenting consequences of cruelty. The fire had claimed nearly the entire mansion, and yet the chaos of collapse was precise, almost ritualistic. The beams snapped, the walls bowed inward, and the ceiling surrendered to gravity with a deafening roar. Smoke and heat filled every corridor, swallowing the familiar architecture, every hall echoing with the ghosts of years spent in cruelty. Elias moved through it all as if walking through silence, a calm observer in the heart of chaos. Thaddeus Gray's strength was failing. He had crawled to the far corner of what remained of the central hall, his hands scorched and raw, his lungs screaming from smoke. Every attempt to rise, to control, to command, ended in futility. He had built his life on domination, but domination requires compliance, and all compliance had dissolved in the precise, patient orchestration of Elias. Fear could no longer serve as armor. Samuel Gray, still trembling, stumbled into the hall, witnessing the annihilation of everything his family had valued. Privilege and power, he realized in horror, could not protect him. The mansion's destruction revealed the fragility underlying all authority that relies on obedience rather than understanding, on intimidation rather than wisdom. The walls burned not just wood and plaster, but the illusions of invincibility, the mirage of untouchable legacy. Elias paused near the collapsed staircase, observing the pattern of destruction. Each structural failure, every splintered beam, every falling wall, was executed according to the plan he had constructed over months. This was not mere chaos. It was education in the purest form. Every crack, every collapse was a lesson in the inevitability of consequences for cruelty, for arrogance, for abuse of power. Outside, the night sky glowed with the fiery remnants of the mansion. Embers carried across the estate, a warning to anyone who might one day attempt similar tyranny. The story of the Gray estate would echo, not for wealth, not for grandeur, but for the collapse of a family that ruled through fear. Elias understood this, as did the survivors, who would carry the lesson for life. He spoke again, calm and deliberate. Control built on fear is temporary. Power maintained by oppression will always contain the blueprint for its own undoing. Every tyrant, every empire, every family built on cruelty will one day confront inevitability. The mansion groaned one final time as the roof sagged, floors buckled, and flame swallowed the last vestiges of structure. The Gray dynasty was erased, not by chance, but by patience, knowledge, and understanding. And in that silence, Elias understood the magnitude of the lesson, an enduring testament to the fragility of fear and the certainty of reckoning. The inferno reached the heart of the mansion, turning ornate floors and gilded walls into molten ruins. Smoke and ash swirled in dense, choking clouds, pressing against the eyes and lungs of the remaining Gray family. Elias moved with methodical calm, fully aware that panic would accelerate the lesson already unfolding. The mansion itself had become a tool of revelation, and he wielded it with absolute precision. Thaddeus Gray lay slumped against a scorched wall, his chest heaving, eyes wide in disbelief. The control he had wielded so effortlessly, over servants, over his sons, over every minor detail of daily life, had been stripped from him. Fear, which had once been a weapon he manipulated with surgical precision, now returned to claim him. Every step he had taken to dominate others had left a blueprint for his own destruction, and tonight, that blueprint was executed without mercy. Samuel Gray clutched his arm, coughing, his body shaking as the heat pressed relentlessly around him. The youngest son, raised on privilege and illusion, finally confronted a truth no tutor or parent had ever imparted. Power is conditional, and the moment it is challenged by intelligence and patience, it collapses like dry timber. The mansion, the fire, the collapse, all were a demonstration that dominance without foresight is a fragile construct. Elias paused at the edge of the central hole, observing the destruction with deliberate detachment. The fire had spread exactly as he had calculated, reaching every hidden chamber, every corridor, every secret that had once symbolized Gray authority. The mansion's collapse was both physical and symbolic. It was an education in inevitability, a lesson in the consequences of arrogance and cruelty, delivered with surgical efficiency. Outside, embers floated into the night sky, painting the darkness with glowing warnings. The surrounding lands would bear witness to the flames, and those who observed them would understand. Oppression, no matter how absolute, carries within it the seeds of its undoing. Elias's voice finally cut through the roar of the fire. Every empire built on fear contains the mechanism of its collapse. Every tyrant, every family, every ruler who believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. Tonight, the mansion teaches the final lesson. The central hole groaned and cracked, the roof giving way as flames consumed the last structural supports. The Gray dynasty, once untouchable, now existed only in memory and ash. And Elias, standing amid the smoke and ruin, knew that the night's work would echo through history, a permanent monument to the fragility of fear and the inevitability of reckoning. The mansion's roar was deafening now, a symphony of collapse and fire, echoing across the estate and into the surrounding darkness. Beams cracked, walls buckled, and the floors collapsed into jagged ruins. Elias moved through the shadows, calm, methodical, observing every detail. The destruction was total, but it was not chaos. Every collapse, every roar of timber, every wave of smoke was part of the lesson he had orchestrated. Thaddeus Gray lay near the remnants of the central hole, coughing, blinded by smoke, utterly powerless. His lifetime of control had disintegrated in hours. Authority, he realized too late, is never absolute. Fear may dominate, but it is fragile. And every system of obedience, every manipulation of human psychology, contains the seeds of its own undoing when confronted with patience and intelligence. Samuel Gray stumbled through the smoke-filled hallways, terrified but alive. He had witnessed the annihilation of his family's empire, and the lesson was indelible. Privilege built on oppression is not protection. It is a trap. Every corridor, every vent, every structural weakness had been exploited not through brute force, but through knowledge, patience, and strategy. The fire had been the instrument of revelation, exposing truth in the harshest possible light. Elias paused at the edge of the central hole, letting the heat and smoke wash over him. He observed the mansion as it surrendered completely to the flames, every room, every hallway, every symbol of Gray authority collapsing in perfect sequence. This was not vengeance. It was precision, a demonstration of inevitability. Every crack, every collapse, every snapping beam was a testament to the fragility of power rooted in fear alone. Outside, embers scattered across the night sky, illuminating the surrounding lands like a warning beacon. Anyone who saw the glow would feel the weight of the lesson. Absolute power maintained through oppression is temporary. Tyrants create the tools of their own destruction, and all empires built on fear will one day face inevitable collapse. Elias finally spoke, his voice low, commanding, and deliberate. Every dynasty that rules through terror teaches the method of its own undoing. Every tyrant, every master, every family that believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. The mansion teaches this lesson tonight. The mansion shuddered one final time, walls giving way, floors collapsing, smoke and flame consuming the last vestiges of the Gray Empire. What remained was ash, memory, and an immutable lesson etched into history. Elias stood amid the ruins, calm, unshaken, a man who had turned patience, intelligence, and understanding into instruments of reckoning. The central hall was nearly unrecognizable now. Flames surged through what remained of the ceiling, twisting rafters like molten steel, sending sparks into the thick, smoke-choked night. The mansion, once a monument to gray authority, had become a ruinous testament to inevitability and precision. Elias walked calmly through the devastation, every step measured, every breath deliberate. The fire roared, but it obeyed him, an instrument of judgment, not chaos. Thaddeus Gray coughed violently, his lungs scorched, his body trembling. He had built his life on fear, on the absolute obedience of those around him, and yet none of it mattered now. Every hidden passage, every secret stair, every corridor he had used to control others had become useless. The mansion, a tool of power in the hands of a tyrant, had been transformed into an instrument of reckoning. He realized, too late, that power maintained through fear is not security. It is fragility itself, a blueprint for inevitable collapse. Samuel Gray stumbled beside his father, the younger son's face streaked with soot, sweat, and terror. His life, built on privilege and the illusion of invulnerability, had been shattered. He had watched the mansion consume itself in deliberate destruction, and in the heat and smoke, he glimpsed the immutable truth. Systems built on oppression will eventually turn inward, dismantling themselves. Elias paused at the threshold of the central hall, observing the fire's pattern of destruction. Each wall, each collapsed floor, each shattering beam confirmed the precision of his orchestration. The mansion was no longer a home, it was a teacher. Every crack and collapse conveyed lessons in inevitability, patience, and the consequences of cruelty. Thaddeus had been the master of fear, but tonight, he was its pupil, and the lesson was total. Outside, the wind carried embers into the surrounding fields, a visual proclamation of collapse and inevitability. The estate, once a symbol of dominance and tyranny, was now a cautionary legend. Anyone who saw the fiery ruins would understand that fear alone cannot protect. Power must be wielded with intelligence, patience, and respect for consequence, or it will be undone. Elias spoke softly, his words deliberate, cutting through the roar of the fire. Every dynasty built on terror sows the seeds of its own destruction. Every tyrant, every master, every family that believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. Tonight, the mansion teaches the final lesson. The last sections of roof collapsed, sending waves of fire into the remaining walls. The Gray dynasty, untouchable no more, existed now only in memory and ash, a monument to fragility and the certainty of reckoning. The fire's intensity had peaked. The mansion's final walls twisted and buckled, collapsing inward in a cacophony of cracking timber and falling stone. Smoke surged outward in thick black waves, blotting out the stars and painting the night sky with the orange glow of annihilation. Elias stood at the edge of the central hall, unshaken, watching as decades of cruelty, arrogance, and oppression burned into ash. Thaddeus Gray lay in the rubble, coughing violently, his hands scorched and blistered. He had been a master of systems, of control, of intimidation, yet every method he had employed had been anticipated, manipulated, and turned against him. For the first time in his life, he understood the fragility of power, the illusion of invincibility. Fear, he realized, could only dominate so long as the wielder of it remained unpredictable, and Elias had mastered the rules of its dismantling. Samuel Gray stumbled near the smoking edges of the hole, choking and shaken. He had been raised in the shadow of privilege and terror, and tonight he had seen the total collapse of both. Every hidden passage, every secret chamber, every corridor designed to protect and preserve the family's legacy had been neutralized. The mansion, once a symbol of domination, had been converted into a classroom of inevitability. The lesson was seared into the walls and air. Tyranny cannot withstand intelligence, patience, and precise orchestration. Elias moved quietly among the ruins, surveying the devastation. The collapse was complete in the upper floors, the ceilings sagging, floors buckled, walls split, and embers drifting upward into the night. Each spark, each crack, each shattering beam was an instrument in the symphony of consequence he had conducted. The fire was a teacher, the mansion, its medium. Outside, embers drifted into the surrounding forest, a visual warning to anyone who might one day follow the path of oppression. The estate's destruction was more than literal. It was symbolic, a permanent demonstration of the fragility of absolute power maintained through Fae. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate, cutting through the roar of fire and smoke. Every empire built on terror contains the instructions for its own destruction. Every tyrant, every master, every family that believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. Tonight, the mansion delivers its final lesson. The last remaining sections of roof fell with a deafening crash, sending fire and debris into the center of the hole. The Grey Dynasty, once untouchable, now existed only in memory, ruin, and ash, a testament to patience, precision, and the unavoidable consequences of cruelty. The mansion shuddered under the final assault of flames, collapsing inward with a sound like the groan of centuries being erased. Smoke poured outward in thick waves, swallowing the night and carrying the acrid scent of scorched timber, plaster, and the remnants of luxury. Elias stood at the edge of the central hole, observing the destruction with deliberate calm. This was not mere fire. It was a revelation, a methodical demonstration of inevitability. Thaddeus Gray coughed violently, his body trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief. Every system he had built to dominate others had failed him. Every hidden passage, every carefully designed staircase, every secret chamber had become useless. The mansion, a symbol of his power, had transformed into a weapon against him. Fae, which had once been his tool, now surrounded him in an inescapable embrace. Samuel Gray stumbled through the smoke, his lungs burning, his mind racing. Privilege and lineage had given him the illusion of safety, but the inferno had shattered that illusion. The mansion had become a lesson. Authority founded solely on intimidation and control is fragile, and the higher one builds, the more spectacularly one can fall. The collapse of the Gray estate was both physical and psychological, teaching the younger generation in the harshest terms the consequences of inherited arrogance. Elias moved silently through the corridors, observing the mansion's slow surrender to the fire. Each falling beam, each shattering wall, each row of collapsing timber was part of the symphony he had orchestrated. This destruction was deliberate, precise, and total. The mansion had become a medium for education in inevitability, a testament to the principle that cruelty sows the seeds of its own demise. Outside, embers drifted into the night, floating across the estate and illuminating the surrounding forest. The glow was more than a spectacle. It was a warning, a visual proclamation of what becomes of empires founded on oppression. Those who saw the light would remember it, long after the flames had died, as a lesson in fragility and consequence. Elias spoke calmly, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. Every dynasty built on fear contains the blueprint of its collapse. Every tyrant, every master, every family who believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. The mansion teaches this lesson tonight. The roof gave way entirely, sending the final embers and fragments crashing into the central hole. The Grey Dynasty, once unassailable, existed now only as ashes, memory, and the indelible lesson of reckoning. Elias remained, silent and unshaken, a man who had turned patience, precision, and understanding into instruments of absolute consequence. The mansion's final skeleton groaned and buckled, the last walls crumbling as fire consumed every remaining beam. Smoke spiraled into the night sky, turning stars into faint, trembling points of light above the glowing inferno. Elias stood at the edge of the devastation, observing with the quiet patience of a man who had orchestrated every detail. This was more than destruction. It was inevitability, a surgical lesson in the collapse of power built on Fae. Thaddeus Gray lay slumped in the rubble, coughing violently, his eyes wide in horror. The empire he had cultivated, his authority, his control, his family legacy, had disintegrated in hours. Every system he had built to maintain obedience had been anticipated and neutralized. For the first time in his life, he understood the fragility of power dependent on Fae. Elias had shown him that tyranny contains the mechanisms of its own undoing. Samuel Gray, gasping and disoriented, clutched his father's arm, witnessing the total annihilation of their family's wealth, their status, and their illusions. He had learned tonight that privilege does not guarantee safety, and that the architecture of oppression can be dismantled with precision, patience, and knowledge. Every corridor, every chamber, every hidden passage that had once symbolized great control had been rendered useless, a testament to inevitability. Elias moved quietly through the hole, inhaling the smoke, feeling the vibrations of collapsing timber beneath his feet. The fire had spread exactly as he had planned, reaching every corner, every secret space, every structural weakness. The mansion itself had become a teacher. Every crack, every collapse, every snap of timber was a lesson in consequence, inevitability, and the fragility of human arrogance. Outside, the wind carried embers over the surrounding forest, illuminating the estate in warning sparks. The glow told a story. Power maintained through fear is temporary, and every empire built on oppression will ultimately confront collapse. Elias's orchestration was complete. The mansion had done its work, and the lesson would endure far longer than the flames. He spoke quietly, his voice deliberate and commanding. Every tyrant, every master, every dynasty that rules through fear will one day encounter the inevitability they create. Every empire built on oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. Tonight, the mansion teaches the final lesson. The final fragments of roof and wall fell into the central hole, sending flames and smoke into the open night. The Grey Dynasty, untouchable no longer, existed only as memory, ash, and a stark warning of the consequences of cruelty and arrogance. Elias remained, calm and resolute, a silent witness to the absolute precision of inevitability. The mansion was now a skeleton of fire and smoke, the remaining walls buckling and collapsing in slow, deliberate waves. Every crack, every roar of splintering timber, every collapse was a testament to the fragility of power when wielded through fear alone. Elias moved among the ruins like a shadow, observing, calculating, fully aware that the lesson had reached its apex. This was not destruction, it was inevitability in motion. Thaddeus Gray lay near the charred remains of the central hole, gasping, eyes wide with horror. The empire he had meticulously built had crumbled in a single night. Every hidden corridor, every secret staircase, every structural advantage he had relied upon for control had been turned against him. The fear he had used to dominate others had become his own cage. In that moment, he understood something he had never comprehended before. The architecture of tyranny always contains the blueprint of collapse. Samuel Gray staggered through the smoky ruins, coughing violently, disoriented by heat and flame. He had grown up in the illusion of invincibility, believing that wealth and lineage could shield him from consequence. Tonight, the mansion had erased that illusion. Every room, every passage, every wall had been neutralized in a deliberate demonstration of inevitability. The collapse was not just physical, it was a psychological lesson, an indelible education in the consequences of inherited arrogance. Elias paused in the center of the hole, the heat pressing against his skin, smoke curling around him like a living entity. The fire had reached every corner he had calculated, consuming every symbol of Gray authority. Each snap of timber, each shattering of plaster, each roar of collapsing stone was part of a precise symphony of reckoning. The mansion itself had become a teacher, delivering a lesson in inevitability with surgical precision. Outside, embers drifted into the night sky, carried by the wind, illuminating the surrounding forest. The glow acted as a warning, a message to any who might seek to rule through fear. Oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and no fortress of wealth or lineage can resist the inevitability of consequence. Elias spoke, calm, deliberate, resonant. Every dynasty built on terror contains the mechanism of its own undoing. Every tyrant, every master, every family that believes themselves untouchable will one day confront inevitability. Tonight, the mansion teaches the final lesson. The last remnants of roof and walls collapsed, and the Gray estate existed now only in ash, smoke, and the memory of reckoning. Elias remained, silent, resolute, a witness to the perfection of inevitability, the tangible manifestation of consequence, and the inescapable law that power misused always self-destructs. The mansion was no more. Only smoldering ruins remained, blackened timber and twisted metal glowing faintly in the night. Smoke rose in thick, curling columns, carrying the acrid scent of charred legacy into the surrounding forest. The Gray Dynasty, once untouchable, existed now only as ash, memory, and the